Your brain works like a living garden. Instead of sunlight and rain, it depends on closeness and connection to thrive. In 2025, the World Health Organization reports that roughly 1 in 6 people worldwide struggle with loneliness, and US polls show nearly 30% of adults feel it weekly. That means huge numbers of brains are left running on drought. When intimacy is scarce, the brain's oxytocin-based bonding responses dip while stress hormones like cortisol remain elevated. Over time, it even starts rewiring itself to expect rejection. Have you ever felt safer alone than reaching out? Type me in the comments if so. So what does that shift really do to the mind? And why can a single hug sometimes stabilize us better than any self-care app? The chemistry of connection. The chemistry behind these experiences is where things get especially revealing. Every time you reach for closeness, your brain doesn't just respond emotionally, it launches a biochemical sequence that shapes how safe and supported you feel. Researchers call this dynamic the chemistry of connection. When touch occurs, like an embrace or even a reassuring hand on the shoulder, dopamine and oxytocin rise together, creating a kind of reset signal for the nervous system. Studies show a rapid oxytocin response to meaningful touch, though researchers caution that measuring peripheral oxytocin is methodologically complex, so we describe the association rather than a simple one-to-one effect. Still, the finding is consistent. Moments of real connection shift the body's chemistry in ways that reduce stress and reinforce trust. You could think of oxytocin and dopamine as fertilizer in that inner garden, allowing resilience and a sense of safety to grow. Cortisol, in contrast, acts more like a creeping toxin. In limited amounts, it sharpens attention, but when chronically elevated, it corrodes memory, concentration, and mood. Intimacy deprivation alters this balance in subtle but measurable ways. Evidence in 2025 suggests that when opportunities for meaningful closeness decline, oxytocin release tends to be lower or less responsive after prolonged touch deprivation. That has consequences for feeling at ease with others. Oxytocin is linked with neural and behavioral patterns associated with trust and bonding in many studies. Touch can help trigger these systems, though the timing and measurement vary by study. Without regular activation, these pathways don't vanish, but they grow less efficient. Participants in long-term studies who lacked access to touch or supportive closeness showed muted oxytocin responses when they later attempted ordinary social exchanges. The system functions, but sluggishly, much like roots absorbing water after seasons of drought. Layered on top of this is the daily environment of 2025. People spend unprecedented amounts of time sustaining relationships through digital platforms, scrolls, emojis, reactions. Yet surveys by the WHO and APA this year show loneliness at record levels, despite all this surface-level connection. The explanation lies in neurochemistry. Text interactions briefly lift dopamine, but they rarely deliver the tactile and sensory feedback that primes an oxytocin response. Digital signals light up for a few seconds, then fade, leaving the stress chemistry unbuffered. Simply put, the brain does not metabolize a heart emoji the same way it metabolizes genuine presence. Without enough replenishment, cortisol steadily fills the gaps. While it's a necessary chemical for short-term performance, chronic levels wear away at the hippocampus, impair memory formation, and cloud decision-making in the prefrontal cortex. The amygdala, meanwhile, grows more reactive, scanning constantly for signs of threat. People caught in this cycle describe ordinary moments, conversations, work tasks, even leisure activities as inexplicably heavy. They aren't imagining the weight. They are experiencing the biochemical load of unbalanced stress hormones that never fully switch off. The paradox sits right here. Human physiology runs on intimacy in much the same way it runs on sleep or nutrition. Deprivation doesn't simply leave us feeling a little lonely. It recruits deeper neural circuits where scarcity rewrites default settings. The brain, deprived of consistent closeness, shifts from trust to conservation, limiting oxytocin release, padding defenses with cortisol, resisting vulnerability. The inner garden doesn't stop entirely, but growth slows, roots curl inward, expecting difficulty ahead. In this mode, even when small moments of connection appear, the brain sometimes struggles to trust them, fearing they won't last. Experimental findings underscore this adaptive but restrictive pattern. Adults who reported rarely receiving affectionate touch showed lower baseline oxytocin during trust-based tasks. Their bodies, meanwhile, carried higher stress signatures, including reduced heart rate variability, a mark of strain in the autonomic nervous system. Cortisol exposures weighed on attention and mood, making it easier to misinterpret neutral situations as hostile. Day to day, that means small conflicts feel magnified, simple demands sap energy, and pleasures fail to register with the same intensity they once carried. Without oxytocin's supportive tone, dopamine peaks flatten and reward feels muted. This is why even advanced digital wellness practices often fall short. Meditation can bring measurable calm, training people to breathe steadily and ease tension, but it does not directly prompt tactile networks that boost oxytocin. By contrast, a hug not only feels warm but activates pressure-sensitive receptors across the skin. Those receptors send signals through the vagus nerve, dampening cortisol release and stimulating emotional regulation pathways. Controlled trials confirm that touch reduces stress markers more quickly than guided relaxation. The gardener analogy fits here. Mindfulness might prune weeds, but only touch restores essential nutrients. The urgency grows sharper as people increasingly substitute digital interactions for embodied ones. On a screen, smiles and laughter look real, yet they cannot transmit the olfactory or tactile cues that humans have relied on for millennia to gauge safety and belonging. This missing layer strips the nervous system of its most powerful regulators. Without sufficient sensory feedback, cortisol expands unchecked, turning background worry into a steady undercurrent of stress. Over weeks and months, that shift accumulates into exhaustion, leaving the brain less adaptable and more prone to pessimistic judgment. Take an ordinary example. A friend likes your social media post. Your brain gets a small dopamine pulse, pleasant but fleeting. Seconds later, you're scrolling again. Contrast that with the grounding effect of a friend's hand on your back during a difficult conversation. The oxytocin release from that single gesture binds memory, quiets stress circuits, and sends the message that someone values you in real time. One lasts for a breath, the other imprints stability across your entire emotional system. In this sense, likes imitate care, but they do not function as replacements for it. The evidence all circles back to the same conclusion: intimacy is not decorative. It operates as a primary nutrient for human neurochemistry, hydration for the emotional soil. Without it, stress accumulates, memory erodes more easily, and optimism shrinks. Brains adapt to deprivation, but that adaptation comes at a cost. Resilience declines, and expectations of connection fall progressively lower. The absence of intimacy does not only create discomfort, it shapes structural function in the brain, normalizing survival strategies that prioritize self-protection over trust. What makes this cycle even more significant is the way scarcity sets new expectations. When the brain grows used to low intimacy, it prepares for loss before closeness even arrives. Cortisol keeps its grip, defensive postures harden. The shift is not a conscious decision but a physiological recalibration designed to minimize harm. Unfortunately, this kind of preparation reinforces exactly the outcomes it fears: hesitation, withdrawal, and a readiness to see rejection in neutral feedback. So the chemistry of connection is more than a story about hormones, it is a story about prediction. The brain adjusts chemistry in anticipation of what it thinks is likely to happen next. And when scarcity continues long enough, the nervous system begins to forecast rejection even before anyone actually turns away. This expectation becomes the next problem, one that shapes choices and rewrites behavior in ways that extend loneliness further. It's the moment where stress biology turns into self-fulfilling prophecy, and the brain, without realizing it, starts preparing for a no before you've even asked the question. When the brain starts expecting rejection, imagine opening a job application you've perfectly prepared, then hesitating before clicking submit because rejection already feels certain. That single choice might seem like low confidence, but patterns like this reveal something deeper. They show how the brain, especially when deprived of intimacy, begins to adjust expectations, scripting outcomes before reality has even happened. One of the clearest neural systems involved is the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. Neuroscience shows the ACC activates both when we experience physical pain and when we endure social rejection. That means exclusion, being ignored, or receiving cold responses doesn't just sting emotionally. It is processed through the same pathways as actual injury. The brain tags rejection as pain that deserves protection. Intimacy normally provides signals, eye contact, touch, laughter, that help regulate and calm this system. When closeness fades, the ACC operates more like a smoke alarm without pause. Small cues like a delayed text or a neutral pause in conversation can feel amplified into signs of danger. Each absence of feedback gets processed as rejection. Because those signals cause pain responses, the brain leans toward the safer choice, avoiding future attempts altogether. Over time, this avoidance grows into an automatic shortcut. The nervous system adapts by linking silence directly with pain, even before rejection truly occurs. Eventually, the idea of reaching out feels dangerous in itself. Like soil left untended, certain corners of the inner garden expect only weeds, so the effort to plant new growth barely begins. Intimacy isn't seen as unlikely, it's assumed to be impossible. Research in 2025 reinforces this cycle. Reports from organizations like the WHO, Harvard's longitudinal studies, and assessments by cognitive testing platforms such as Craos describe loneliness as predictive of social withdrawal. People who identify as chronically lonely aren't only struggling with disconnection, they're also less likely to start new relationships and more likely to retreat from potential ones. The paradox is clear: the people most in need of closeness engage less. The outcome is not a result of preference, but of rewired behavior that interprets connection as unsafe. This recurring expectation forms what can be thought of as neural pessimism. Once set in motion, the circuitry forecasts rejection even under neutral or ambiguous conditions. Like an overactive weather predictor calling for storms on clear days, the brain insists rejection is imminent. The impact reaches beyond protecting feelings. It restricts curiosity and narrows openness. Distractions or small slip-ups from others become exaggerated into proof of dismissal. When a friend cancels, the brain frames it as permanent. When a partner seems distracted, it sounds like abandonment. Facts play little role once neural pessimism dominates. The interpretation always bends toward loss. For those caught inside it, this feels like sabotage unfolding against their own intentions. People craving closeness find themselves skipping invitations, withholding messages, or declining to attend chances for connection. Outsiders can't see the obstacle and often mistake the quietness for indifference. But the real barrier is the brain's discouraging internal commentary. It whispers, "Don't try," because safety, in a narrow sense, is prioritized over potential fulfillment. That commentary often sounds familiar, as though it carries the tone of an old warning. Think of a relative who always reminds you not to get your hopes up, except now the advice comes from inside your own head. Deprived neural circuits echo that pattern, treating every attempt as a waste of energy. Each time action might be taken, the inner script delivers a resigned warning. Don't message them, they'll ignore you. Because these thoughts seem self-generated, they carry authority. They're harder to dismiss than external opinions. The trap deepens as deprivation adds multiple layers to isolation. The external environment may already hold fewer interactions, fewer gestures of closeness, but overlaid is the internal block, the hardwired tendency to avoid even when opportunities do appear. You think of inviting someone to lunch, but the imagined dismissal feels unbearable, so you stay silent. You picture reconnecting with an old friend, but your mind convinces you they've forgotten you, so there's no text. The cycle preserves distance under the pretext of defense, even while amplifying loneliness. This shift has visible effects on behavior. People moving under these conditions often pull back in subtle, observable ways, avoiding eye contact, staying quiet in conversation, or declining social risks. From the outside, this protective stance reads as aloof or uninterested. Internally, though, it's the nervous system guarding against anticipated injury. The paradox is brutal. The very behavior meant to prevent rejection ensures prolonged isolation. No one can step closer if those signals push them away. Understanding how the circuitry works doesn't erase the frustration, but it reframes loneliness as more than laziness or lack of effort. The ACC, built to detect and protect against harm, becomes oversensitive when touch and intimacy are scarce. Its protective rewiring removes the drive for risk-taking that new relationships require. Rather than nurturing potential growth, the system hardens against planting anything new. What the outside world interprets as quiet coldness is, inside, a tightly wound defense system repelling injury. Left unchecked, this internal defense doesn't remain contained to how one treats others. The discouraging voice grows sharper, folding back onto self-perception as well. Instead of merely expecting no from people outside, the inner script starts sculpting identity around rejection. Scarcity invites the brain not only to predict future pain from others, but also to decide unworthiness within the self. That shift deepens the drought's damage. Not only is the soil left barren, but the gardener begins to believe the soil was always too poor to grow anything at all. And that is where the pattern takes its heaviest toll. Once the inner dialogue reframes rejection as inherent to who you are, the drought no longer just shapes relationships, it reshapes identity itself. Next, how these changes alter the way you see yourself, and why the story echoing inside your mind is not only psychological, but deeply biological. The mirror gets distorted. When the brain begins absorbing rejection into self-identity, the mirror you use to see yourself starts to bend. This distortion isn't only about how others view you, it's about how your own internal systems narrate your worth. Scientists often trace this shift to the default mode network, or DMN. The DMN is the brain network most active during self-focused thought and memory recall, and studies show that prolonged social isolation is associated with increased rumination and DMN overactivity. In other words, when intimacy is scarce, the brain's natural narrator tends to recycle worries, amplifying doubt until criticism feels like the dominant truth. Consider how this plays out in daily life. If you message a friend and they don't reply for hours, a socially supported brain might label the pause as harmless. They're probably distracted or busy. But under the pressure of isolation, the DMN loop tells another story entirely. They're ignoring me, they don't like me. That voice doesn't wait for evidence, it fills the silence with threat. Or imagine replaying a conversation from the day. Instead of remembering it neutrally, the DMN highlights every tiny awkward pause, reinterpreting them as proof that you embarrassed yourself. These are two of the most common distortions, magnifying past interactions and misattributing the intentions of others. They're exaggerated, but they feel convincing because the DMN produces them automatically in the absence of social reassurance. Research updated in 2025 reinforces this link. On brain scans, socially isolated individuals consistently show greater DMN activity compared to those with richer interpersonal connections. Behaviorally, they report sharper self-criticism and an increased tendency to worry about imagined negative outcomes. Importantly, these shifts are not permanent. The data suggest probabilities, not fate. Prolonged isolation is associated with higher levels of rumination and distorted self-interpretation, but reconnection and intimacy can dial this activity back down. The garden hasn't been destroyed, it is simply malnourished. One measurable outcome of this overactive narrator is its connection to mental health. Elevated rumination tied to DMN hyperactivity is linked in research to higher rates of anxiety and depression symptoms. Put simply, when your brain repeats loops of self-criticism without external correction, it doesn't just sound unpleasant, it pushes stress chemistry, mood, and attention into darker states. Quick test: if your mind replays conversations at night and makes them worse each time, you are likely experiencing the DMN loop. Stick around, because later we'll cover practical steps for easing it. What makes this phenomenon especially tricky is how self-reinforcing it becomes. The more you expect disapproval, the more withdrawn your behavior grows. Withdraw and you receive less affirmation from others. The DMN then takes that silence and converts it into more negativity. Over time, the voice doesn't just analyze, it indicts. A small work error becomes evidence you're incompetent. A missed invitation feels like proof that you're unwanted. Without the balancing effect of social feedback, the DMN hands down verdicts on identity. This is where ambiguity, normally tolerable, turns toxic. A neutral pause in conversation or the simple quiet of an unanswered email becomes unbearable because the narrator assigns hostile meaning to it. In socially enriched contexts, ambiguity is gentle background noise. In isolation, it is recoded as accusation. The DMN doesn't leave ambiguity open, it closes the door with criticism. Now it's important to underline, these patterns are not moral failings or permanent scars. They are byproducts of a neural system running unbalanced. Just as cortisol surges in stress and eases once calm returns, DMN overactivity quiets once intimacy reappears. A single reassuring presence, a laugh, a hug, or a direct moment of acknowledgement shrinks its volume significantly. People describe the relief not as revelation, but as silence after noise, like a roommate finally leaving the room. Scientific evidence aligns with this everyday account. Controlled studies demonstrate that social contact and touch reduce DMN hyperactivity, restoring balance and reducing the weight of self-critical thoughts. What feels like character clarity is often just neural shift, a system being recalibrated by feedback it needed all along. This distinction matters. It reframes self-criticism not as personal truth, but as an error in the brain's prediction machinery. That reframing is essential because DMN distortions can escalate. If left unchecked, the line between "they dislike me" and "I am unlikable" blurs. The external interpretation folds inward as identity, and the mirror no longer reflects fairly. It's the weeds overtaking the image, not because the soil was flawed, but because nutrients ran dry. Without correction, this distortion layer deepens until ordinary life events feel like evidence of fundamental failure. From a practical perspective, recognizing the role of this system offers an anchor. Knowing that the DMN spins louder when deprived gives space to question its commentary. The content of the voice is not always evidence. It is sometimes just absence filling silence. That insight alone provides room to hold self-criticism more lightly, as a signal of deprivation rather than proof of unworthiness. Of course, distorted self-perception carries costs beyond internal narratives. Stress is one of the first systems to feel the spillover. When the DMN convinces you that every pause is rejection and every choice risky, the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, absorbs the shock. Lacking the balance that social reassurance normally offers, alarms trigger more easily and they run longer. This is why days feel heavier, decisions harder, and small setbacks more paralyzing when intimacy is missing. So intimacy deprivation doesn't just bend the mirror through which you see yourself. It lets an overactive inner narrator turn silence into accusation and small events into sweeping judgments. And once those distortions spill into your stress systems, the weight of ordinary problems grows, which leads to the next question: why does stress itself feel many times heavier when there's no one to call? Stress without a safety net. Stress without support feels heavier because the brain systems for regulating pressure depend on signals of safety from others. At the heart of this process is the amygdala, a small structure deep in the temporal lobe that serves as the alarm center. It constantly scans the environment for signs of threat, whether real or imagined, and activates the body's stress response when it senses danger. Heart rate rises, cortisol is released, attention narrows. This cascade works well when immediate action is needed, but without a reliable way to turn the alarm down, the body stays locked in high alert and responds as if every inconvenience were an impending crisis. Normally, intimacy provides that missing off switch. When someone offers presence through a touch, a calm voice, or even simple eye contact, the nervous system and the amygdala receive confirmation that things are safe. Research shows this works partly through oxytocin pathways that directly influence stress regulation. A moment of connection tells the alarm system it can rest. With these cues present, stress not only feels less overwhelming, it is physically reduced at the neural level. When social closeness is absent, this regulatory factor disappears. The amygdala fires more freely without the cues that calm it. Small events like a late bus or a delayed reply can ignite an exaggerated reaction. The stress system keeps burning unchecked. Problems don't necessarily get bigger, yet the brain amplifies them, stuck in emergency mode. This is why leaning on a friend after a difficult day often provides relief, even when the situation hasn't changed. The amygdala quiets once comfort is received, showing how vital relational buffering is to resilience. Recent evidence reported in 2025 demonstrates a strong link between loneliness and amygdala dysregulation. Brain scans reveal that individuals reporting persistent social isolation show heightened amygdala activity even during calm or neutral circumstances. Instead of toggling between arousal and rest, their systems stay activated, like an alarm that never switches off. This hyperactivity contributes to a state of constant low-grade fight or flight. Stress hormones circulate too often, decision-making suffers under pressure, and biological systems like cardiovascular regulation destabilize. Research shows chronic stress and loneliness are linked to persistent amygdala activation and changes in hippocampal volume, factors that explain why reactivity rises and memory problems emerge when isolation continues. The hippocampus sits near the amygdala and normally helps integrate memory with emotional regulation, but persistent stress exposes this region to high levels of cortisol. Over extended time, chronic stress can reduce hippocampal volume. Multiple imaging studies over the last decade found smaller hippocampal structures in people reporting years of social disconnection compared to their more supported peers. The 2025 findings strengthen this pattern. The practical outcome: memory weakens, details become harder to retain, and the hippocampus struggles to coordinate with the amygdala. This makes it more difficult to calm down once stress flares, and the brain loops longer in alarm states. To illustrate this in everyday terms, with intimacy, spilling coffee might be a minor frustration followed by a laugh. Without intimacy, the alarm misfires, signaling catastrophe instead. If hippocampal function is weakened by ongoing stress, calming that reaction becomes even harder. What should be a small nuisance ends up setting a mood for the entire day. The perspective isn't a personal flaw, it arises from worn regulatory systems. The analogy of a smoke detector helps capture this. A detector is designed to alert when true danger presents, but without proper regulation, it shrieks at harmless signals: steam, toast, or light smoke from a candle. The stress system under loneliness does the same. The amygdala trips at minor inconveniences, convinced they point to disaster. Living in that climate produces exhaustion. Every small challenge feels amplified into emergency status. It's not about thin skin, but about faulty calibration. Consequences ripple out. A missed text becomes intolerable. Feedback at work feels like threat. Coping resources dry up because recovery time shrinks. Resilience depends on a cycle, stress rising then de-escalating. Without close relationships, the second step doesn't happen as quickly, so the body spends hours locked in tension. Cortisol lingers into sleep, disrupting rest and mood regulation. Over weeks and months, fatigue piles up, eroding both concentration and emotional patience. Updated studies in 2025 give measurable weight to these observations. Survey participants with weak social ties reported not just more frequent stress, but more intense responses to minor triggers. Cognitive tasks that mildly challenge most brains spiked heart rates significantly higher among the lonely group. Functional imaging backed this with visible amygdala overactivity. The patterns confirm that it isn't imagination. Without social regulation, stress isn't just perceived as heavier, it is actively heightened in the nervous system itself. Understanding this shifts how we frame loneliness. It isn't a vague sadness or personality issue. It is a disruption in neurobiology that alters how the brain meets difficulty. The amygdala overreacts, the hippocampus strains under cortisol, and the absence of balance makes ordinary life feel unmanageable. Health consequences spread outward too, since stress hormones affect more than mood. They influence immune function, digestion, and cardiovascular systems. Disconnection, then, becomes a full-body vulnerability. Yet the research does not suggest permanent loss. These changes are not fixed. Social reconnection and interventions can help recovery. Studies indicate hippocampal structure shows improvement when chronic stress eases, and stress responses recalibrate when sustained intimacy returns. The noise of the alarm system can quiet again, provided signals of safety are restored. The brain evolved expecting those signals to be part of daily life, and when they return, regulatory balance can strengthen again. This also clarifies why even small forms of contact matter. A friend's voice, a reliable presence, even brief gestures of warmth activate regulatory systems that build resilience. Not every burden can be removed, but the nervous system doesn't demand perfection. It demands signals of belonging to offset alarms. Without them, stress chemistry dominates. With them, the same problems shift from unbearable to surmountable. The truth here isn't about willpower or toughness. It's about circuitry that evolved to operate with companionship woven into its regulation. Stress networks are designed around cooperative living. Isolation pulls that foundation away, leaving inner systems incomplete. That's why people in these states describe ordinary living as draining. It isn't weakness, it's the body's architecture struggling without the context it was built for. The humor of the amygdala reacting like a smoke detector to toast underscores a deeper reality. Living with loneliness means fighting alarms that misread constant danger. This produces fatigue, irritability, and brain fog that make even simple tasks feel punishing. Intimacy provides the one tool internal systems can't replicate on their own, a reliable cue of external safety that silences alarms. Pep talks help, but they don't touch the circuitry in the same way. The difference is biological. So at this point, the pattern forms clearly. Without intimacy, stress responses stay locked on high. The amygdala sounds alarms without pause, the hippocampus weakens under cortisol, and the brain's default networks fill silence with pessimism. These aren't abstract metaphors, but real physiological shifts that explain why life without closeness feels heavier in every dimension. The absence of intimacy destabilizes people chemically, neurologically, and physically. And here, another critical question opens. If the brain treats isolation like actual threat, keeping alarms firing and mental systems strained, what happens in the realm of physical pain? If loneliness pushes your biology to behave as if you've been injured, could it also change how strongly you feel actual aches in the body? Loneliness hurts, literally. Why does rejection or loss sometimes register in the body as sharp chest pain or a deep ache beneath the ribs? People don't just imagine that heaviness. It's the brain using the same systems that monitor physical injury to process social wounds. Research shows the overlap is very real. The circuits responsible for physical pain also respond to emotional pain. That is why loneliness doesn't stay confined to mood. It can hurt in the body itself. Central to this link are two brain regions, the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. These regions activate reliably when you burn your hand or stub your toe, but the same activation appears during social loss or rejection. Experiments confirm that being excluded, ignored, or cut off lights up those pain-processing networks. When intimacy is absent, these regions stay sensitive, as though preparing for damage. Small social disappointments, a cancelled plan, an unanswered text, walking past colleagues without acknowledgement, can register bodily, producing an ache that mirrors physical pain. In this way, disconnection generates what feels like injury even when no tissue is harmed. The natural counterweight to this discomfort is the body's endorphin system. Endorphins are the brain's built-in opioids, the chemicals that both relieve physical pain and enhance feelings of comfort and warmth. Activities involving connection, like hugging, laughter in a group, affectionate touch, or even synchronized movements such as dancing, often trigger endorphin release. What's striking is the dual effect. The same chemistry that produces relaxation also acts as pain relief. Closeness doesn't just make people feel emotionally supported, it cushions pain networks physiologically. This is why social support can feel like medicine. It dulls discomfort while deepening trust. Controlled studies strengthen that connection further. Massage experiments consistently demonstrate reductions in reported pain, alongside increases in oxytocin and endorphin-related markers. Couple support studies also show that holding a partner's hand during a painful stimulus reduces, both brain activation and pain networks, and the subjective intensity of the pain. These findings confirm that affectionate touch directly influences the body's ability to regulate pain perception. This isn't abstract, it's measurable biology in action. Without intimacy, however, this buffering is less available. To be clear, endorphins don't disappear, but reduced frequency of affectionate touch means natural pain relief systems are less often activated. Research shows people deprived of closeness or physical contact report greater sensitivity to everyday aches. Pain that might otherwise be softened lingers longer or feels more intense. Loneliness doesn't create pain out of nothing, but it amplifies existing discomfort and correlates with higher prevalence of chronic pain conditions like migraines, fibromyalgia, and back pain. Surveys in 2025 consistently report a strong overlap between reported loneliness and chronic pain scores. The chemistry explains the complaints. Fewer endorphin responses leave the nervous system more exposed to unbuffered pain signals. This connection forms a self-sustaining cycle that can be hard to interrupt. Pain drains emotional energy, which makes it harder to reach out for support. Reduced outreach means fewer moments of closeness, which further limits endorphin release. Pain then continues unchecked, often worsening the discouragement that blocked outreach in the first place. The loop is both psychological and biochemical, and recognizing it helps explain why isolation feels exhausting. The body isn't just managing mood, it's struggling without its usual chemical relief. If you've ever noticed that a headache feels less burdensome when someone sits beside you compared to when you sit alone, you've experienced this system firsthand. A hug during that moment provides more than symbolic comfort. The warmth and pressure activate receptors in the skin that promote endorphin release, which in turn reduces pain signal intensity. This is why physical closeness can feel like anesthesia naturally brewed by the body. In periods of loneliness, by contrast, that feedback occurs less often. A stubbed toe feels sharper, a strained muscle nags longer. The body has lost one of its built-in pain regulators simply because connection is scarce. A modern way to frame it is to imagine the pharmacy in your brain. Shelves full of powerful painkillers, endorphins, sit ready, but they only release when triggered by human connection. In recent years, surveys show people report fewer occasions of friendly touch or physical affection, even within families and partnerships. Pharmacies may stock painkillers in bottles, but they cannot replicate the same release provided through intimacy. When touch is rare, it's like the pharmacy's doors remain closed. This leaves society more vulnerable to amplified pain experiences that no pill fully offsets. For public health, this perspective demands attention. Treating loneliness only as sadness or a lifestyle complaint underestimates its reach. Imaging studies and symptom reports demonstrate that social disconnection activates the same networks responsible for pain regulation, weakens immune resilience, and alters hormonal balance. Labeling loneliness as purely emotional obscures the low-level injury occurring across systems each day. By reframing it as both emotional and physical, an invisible pain condition, society may begin prioritizing intimacy as an essential part of health rather than viewing it as optional. Online connections illustrate this limitation. Sending a message or receiving an emoji response may provide a fleeting lift of dopamine, the motivation-related transmitter, but dopamine does not dull pain signals. Endorphins do. That is why digital consolation may help emotionally while leaving the body's hurt unsoftened. People may feel in touch online yet remain physically untouched, reporting higher pain sensitivity. This gap explains the common outcome. Digital comfort sustains mood briefly, but fails to quiet the body's pain processing systems. Only embodied intimacy, presence, voice, touch, activates the full range of relief. The imagery of the garden still applies. In that analogy, endorphins are the nutrients embedded in the soil, cushioning roots when the environment bears down. With intimacy, they replenish and strengthen the garden's foundations. Without them, the ground hardens and stress cracks the surface more easily. Pain, like external pressure, pushes deeper into this brittle state because the biochemical padding is missing. Efforts to add light or water may help minimally, but growth continues to falter until the nutrient supply returns. Practical examples illustrate this difference starkly. A person managing minor back discomfort while living alone may find it draining and unrelenting. The same back discomfort in someone with frequent supportive interactions often feels more manageable, not because the injury is smaller, but because conversations, laughter, or affectionate touch activate endorphins that blunt the perception of pain. The symptom is present in both bodies, yet the chemistry alters the suffering dramatically. Endorphins create padding between bodily signals and brain perception, turning raw sensation into something easier to bear. Population studies highlight this disparity across groups. Pain clinics note that patients reporting loneliness often present with higher pain intensity, and more overlapping mental health concerns. Meanwhile, people with robust social support networks generally tolerate discomfort more effectively. This isn't wishful thinking, but a physiological difference tied to whether endorphin systems activate regularly in response to intimacy. Without that activation, pain feels sharper, lasts longer, and erodes overall well-being. For viewers, the takeaway is practical. If persistent pain and loneliness occur together, research suggests that working on social connection is not only an emotional strategy, but also a physical one. Attention to intimacy can soften pain perception in measurable ways, making recovery or coping easier. This doesn't mean pain disappears, but it means the nervous system gains access to one of its strongest natural defenses. Thinking of loneliness through this lens clarifies why it feels like an invisible injury. There is no broken bone to display on an X-ray, yet the pain networks activate just as if tissue were damaged. The absence of intimacy robs the body of an internal painkiller that thousands of years of evolution embedded for survival. Connection reopens that pathway, returning analgesia the brain can't produce in isolation. Dismissing this reality as mere mood downplays the extent of biological stress involved. All of this raises a further consideration. If isolation intensifies physical pain, how does that affect the trust and security within the relationships we do have? A body in discomfort evaluates interactions differently. Pain makes signals of closeness feel less stable and increases the likelihood of misinterpreting safety as threat, which leads naturally to another puzzle. Even when relationships look steady from the outside, why does a deprived brain start doubting their strength? Fragile bonds and shaky ground. Why does a steady friendship or partnership sometimes start to feel shaky even when nothing obvious has changed? This effect isn't just about insecurity or poor communication. It can emerge when intimacy signals become scarce. The brain's circuits that normally reinforce closeness rely on regular input to stay calibrated. Without it, bonds that are in fact stable may be misread as fragile. The brain begins scanning for threat where none exists, leaving you feeling like the ground beneath your connections is cracking, even if the surface looks intact. Under ordinary conditions, rewarding social experiences release dopamine, which helps reinforce the sense that a relationship is valuable and dependable. Shared laughter, touch, or consistent warmth send cues that the bond is worth trusting. Over time, these dopamine-driven reinforcements teach the brain to register certain people as sources of security. But when intimacy becomes infrequent, those reinforcing responses weaken. Neuroscience doesn't support the idea that dopamine operates like a daily pill. Rather, it reinforces rewarding social interactions over time, integrating them into the brain's broader evaluation of trust. Without regular input, the signal grows less vivid. A relationship may remain strong in reality, but the brain interprets it as less rewarding, and therefore begins labeling it as less secure. When that reinforcement fades, uncertainty rises. Without consistent intimacy-driven cues, the mind struggles to predict what others feel, and that void gets filled with speculation. This often translates into behaviors that can destabilize connections. Jealousy, where you search for hints that affection is being withdrawn. Clinginess, where you push harder for reassurance. Or retreat, where you preemptively create distance to avoid loss. None of these responses necessarily reflect the actual state of the relationship. They are reactions to missing neurochemical signals that usually quiet doubt. This creates a paradox. Even when no betrayal or rupture occurs, trust feels fragile. A partner preoccupied with work or a friend who waits a bit longer than usual to reply may trigger suspicion that the bond is fading. The absence of reassurance is misread as evidence of threat. In these moments, what seems unstable is not the relationship itself, but the internal chemistry that normally flags reliable bonds as secure. The brain in this state behaves almost like a conspiracy theorist, examining ordinary details and spinning them into alarming patterns. A missed call can morph into proof of rejection. A distracted look can be read as hidden resentment. This habit of pattern-making aligns with research showing that deprivation in the reward system increases sensitivity to potential threats and drives the brain to detect signals in neutral noise. So when intimacy is lacking, suspicion feels justified because your internal systems are primed to see danger where none exists. A common example brings this home. You text a close friend and hours pass without a response. In a brain nourished by recent and meaningful intimacy, this delay is buffered by trust. You assume ordinary explanations, they're busy, resting, or away from their phone. But in a system under intimacy drought, the lack of feedback sparks a cascade. They're upset with me, they're pulling away. This leap doesn't come from evidence, it comes from the absence of reinforcing dopamine confirmation. What was simply a nap is recoded as a sign of disinterest. At its root, intimacy stabilizes perception by building trust into the reward pathways themselves. Those circuits then act like anchors. Even when signals aren't immediately available, they help you maintain confidence in connection. Without them, the mind overreacts to gaps in information, filling the silence with worry. That's why intimacy is not only about emotional warmth, it functions as cognitive reassurance, strengthening the brain's ability to process neutral behavior as continuity, not collapse. The consequences extend beyond private thought. Once trust is questioned internally, behavior starts to shift. You might press for evidence of loyalty, withdraw communication, or read hidden meanings into small gestures. These behaviors can themselves strain the connection, creating tension in relationships that were otherwise stable. The cycle repeats. Intimacy drought alters brain chemistry. Altered chemistry produces suspicion. Suspicion affects behavior, and behavior risks destabilizing the very bond you hope to protect. This process is subtle but accumulative. In the garden metaphor we've used, plants remain in place, but the soil grows harder without steady rain. A healthy bond can exist on the surface, yet the underlying support weakens. Small stresses, like pauses in communication, carry more weight than they should. The misreading occurs not because the ground is collapsing, but because the brain, deprived of its usual chemical nutrients, experiences every pause as fragile terrain. The same misinterpretation unfolds in wider contexts too. At work, colleagues, neutral actions may be recast as dismissive. In communities, routine gaps in interaction may be judged as exclusion. Once again, the relationships themselves are often sound. It is the perception that shifts, weakened by chemistry rather than fact. The fragile quality arises in interpretation, not in reality. Humor sharpens the picture. The intimacy-deprived brain can resemble a red string conspiracy war, connecting unrelated signals into ominous patterns. A single evening spent alone by a partner becomes proof of waning interest, or a friend's late reply morphs into definite rejection. As research suggests, loneliness correlates with a heightened bias toward detecting threat in ambiguous cues. Combine that bias with low reward signals, and the brain constructs stories from shadows. It feels persuasive in the moment, even though the logic is stretched as thin as believing aliens run the neighborhood convenience store. The key is understanding that this reaction stems from chemistry, not permanent personality traits. People often self-label as clingy or overly suspicious, but many of those feelings are predictable results of neurotransmitter systems operating without consistent reinforcement. Dopamine and oxytocin usually provide balance. Their absence reduces confidence in connection. Reframing it this way helps reduce shame, shifting the emphasis toward rebuilding sources of closeness rather than blaming character. Recognizing this also points to one simple practice for everyday life. If you notice yourself interpreting neutral behavior as rejection, pause and list at least 2 other possible explanations before reacting. This small cognitive habit counters the bias your brain leans into under deprivation. By deliberately generating alternatives, maybe they're caught up at work, maybe they forgot to charge their phone, you introduce space for patience. It won't replace the neurochemistry of intimacy, but it slows the spiral and preserves bonds that might otherwise fray under unnecessary suspicion. In this light, the stabilizing role of intimacy becomes clearer. Its benefits extend beyond emotional closeness. It reinforces the very circuitry your brain depends on to interpret relationships as trustworthy. Consistent, genuine contact builds resilience against doubt, allowing ordinary pauses to remain just pauses rather than cracks. Without it, even reliable partnerships can feel uncertain, not because they are at risk, but because your brain cannot secure them with the same chemical certainty. The perception of fragility then arises internally, and the behavioral consequences feed outward. And these effects do not stop with waking life. The same neural systems that monitor connection during the day also shape how the brain rests at night. When reassurance from intimacy is missing, vigilance rises and rest becomes lighter. The neural ground feels as shaky in bed as it does in conversation, which leads to the next question. How does the absence of intimacy change the way the body drifts into sleep, and why might rest itself feel less safe in its absence? The sleep connection. At night, the absence of intimacy shows up in one of the most important biological rhythms we have: sleep. Rest isn't simply the body shutting down, it's an active state managed by hormones, brain waves, and neural regulators. And intimacy plays a central role in keeping those systems balanced. Without supportive signals during the day, the architecture of sleep changes in ways that make rest less restorative. What people often describe as tossing, turning, or waking in the night is not just stress. It reflects a missing layer of neurochemical protection intimacy normally provides. Studies tracking sleep patterns consistently show that people in affectionate, supportive relationships tend to log deeper and more consolidated cycles of sleep than those who feel socially isolated. REM sleep, the stage most strongly tied to memory consolidation, emotional processing, and vivid dreaming shows some of the clearest differences. Partners who share closeness or people who receive steady, affectionate touch get richer REM activity, while individuals experiencing isolation tend to show fragmented or lighter patterns of rest. In practice, this means intimacy extends beyond daytime mood. It influences how fully your brain and body recover after dark. Two hormones appear regularly in this discussion: oxytocin and prolactin. Oxytocin, a key bonding signal in the brain, is associated with calm and lowered reactivity, and it contributes to lower blood pressure and dampened amygdala intensity. Prolactin, which rises after intimacy and affectionate contact, prolongs relaxation and helps keep the nervous system in a drowsy, receptive state. Studies show affectionate relationships correlate with deeper, more restful sleep and lower nighttime cortisol. Oxytocin and prolactin are part of this hormonal picture. Scientists emphasize that intimacy doesn't guarantee perfect cycles, but it supports the systems that regulate restorative rest. Without those cues, stress pathways hold greater influence. When intimacy is scarce, the opposite pattern often appears. Cortisol, which usually tapers toward night to permit calm, can stay elevated. High evening cortisol delays sleep onset, keeps heart rate higher than needed for deep sleep, and fragments the cycles of REM and slow wave rest once you do fall asleep. The effect isn't dramatic in a single night, but over weeks it compounds into restlessness, fatigue, and heightened emotional reactivity by day. Intimacy helps regulate the systems that promote restorative sleep, while deprivation tends to keep cortisol elevated and fragment the neural pathways that underpin renewal. This explains why lying in bed with a looping mind feels impossible to quiet. It's not only thought patterns fueling the churn, but the absence of oxytocin's calming influence and prolactin's quieting tone. Without these, the body resists letting its defenses down. People sometimes interpret this as poor sleep hygiene, but the biology reaches deeper than bedtime routines. It reflects a chemistry designed to quiet only when safety has been repeatedly signaled through connection. Behavioral substitutes try to address this loss. Weighted blankets, sleep apps, or melatonin supplements offer partial sensory comfort, but they do not replace the hormonal effects of in-person touch. They can soothe anxiety at the surface, but they lack the oxytocin-driven influence that supports the nervous system through the night. That distinction clarifies why such strategies help some but rarely resolve the deeper fatigue tied to persistent loneliness. The scaffolding helps, but the actual structure remains incomplete without intimacy. The effects form a straightforward chain. Lack of intimacy keeps cortisol high, that elevation fragments REM cycles. Fragmented REM weakens both memory consolidation and emotional regulation the next day. From the outside, it looks like irritability, loss of focus, and impatience. Internally, it is disrupted sleep chemistry re-emerging in daily behavior. These downstream changes explain why isolated individuals often describe mornings as heavy, concentration as spotty, and relationships as harder to sustain. The disruption doesn't end at night, it echoes throughout waking life. The same chain extends into immunity and health. Much of the immune system's repair and regulation occurs during deep stages of sleep. Cortisol spikes interfere with the signaling proteins and inflammatory regulators deployed at night. The background research ties sleep disruption from social isolation to downstream immune and cognitive problems, so restoring connection helps across daily life, not only at bedtime. The next morning's mood and thinking are just one part of a much larger physiological impact. Put more simply, intimacy deprivation makes recovery incomplete. A person may technically log 8 hours in bed, but the restoration inside those hours is thinner. Memories aren't filed correctly, emotional states aren't stabilized as effectively, and the immune system doesn't refresh to the same degree. Instead, people wake carrying deficits. Over weeks, those small deficits pile up. The result is not just tiredness, but a cascade of vulnerability that makes stress sharper, mood swings stronger, and concentration weaker. Practical examples illustrate this difference. Someone living with regular affectionate contact often describes mornings as grounded even after stress-filled days, because high-quality sleep replenished them overnight. Someone living without consistent closeness may spend the same hours in bed but rise feeling foggy, unrestored, as if the night provided little shelter. The difference is not discipline but biology, a chemistry system that requires reassurance to enter and sustain quality sleep. Some try to counter fatigue through caffeine, late-night routines, or sleep aids, hoping to override problems. But the hormonal context means those approaches only skim across the surface. They may knock a person into sleep, but they don't replicate the stability of oxytocin and prolactin lowering reactivity and cortisol being suppressed through a real sense of closeness. The outcome is often shallow rest, leaving people repeating the same cycle day after day. Public health data add weight to these personal accounts. Populations reporting high loneliness also report greater sleep instability and a higher prevalence of insomnia complaints. In follow-up testing, those same groups show increased inflammation markers, greater frequency of colds, and reduced cognitive flexibility. Biology reveals the reason. Without consistent interpersonal reassurance, the brain treats the environment as potentially unsafe, keeping defenses up even while lying in bed. The garden metaphor helps articulate this. Daytime intimacy waters the soil so that nighttime regeneration can occur. Without it, the soil stays cracked, exposed to harsh air even after dusk falls. Rest in this state is like trying to recover in dry soil, possible in part but incomplete. Plants may survive, but growth falters. By morning, resilience is thinner. This is the everyday reality for people navigating life under conditions of deprivation. Knowing this reframes poor sleep not as failure but as predictable outcome. The body is not dysfunctional. It is attempting to protect itself in the absence of the signals it evolved to rely on. When affection arrives, the system recalibrates quickly. Oxytocin quiets the amygdala, prolactin deepens relaxation, and cortisol recedes, allowing cycles of REM and deep sleep to unfold with fewer ruptures. Restoration depends not only on hours of darkness, but on the chemistry that intimacy makes possible. What follows is a loop. Loss of intimacy leads to restless nights. Restless nights amplify emotional volatility. Volatility makes connection more challenging, and the scarcity deepens further. Recognizing the loop is vital, because breaking it requires restoring contact, not only for emotional support but for physical rest. Sleep quality becomes both a reflection of intimacy and a contributor to how possible connection feels the next day. Modern tools that promise substitutes extend the dilemma. Digital chats, late-night video calls, or long message exchanges provide stimulation but often fail to produce genuine sleep stability. Biological systems overlook content, they look for sensory confirmation. Without eye contact, touch, or shared presence, oxytocin pathways remain mostly silent. This explains why you may finish a lively call with someone you care about and still find yourself staring at the ceiling afterward. The stimulation stays, but the nervous system has not received the chemistry of safety it recognizes. Here lies another turning point. Technology grants access to others at all hours, yet sleep research shows that this access cannot fully stand in for embodied presence. If intimacy during the day shapes recovery at night, then digital forms, however abundant, leave gaps. That gap frames a larger puzzle about what digital intimacy provides. Is it true nourishment for a lonely system, or only temporary distraction that evaporates by morning? Digital intimacy, nourishment, or junk food? Why does a stream of video calls, text chains, and late-night chats feel satisfying in the moment, yet still leave a residue of emptiness compared to a simple hug? The topic here is digital intimacy. Does it nourish us, or is it closer to junk food for the social brain? Screens deliver vivid sights and sounds. You can see facial expressions, hear laughter, listen to comforting tones. These inputs light up reward pathways, especially dopamine, producing a small surge of connection. But what they lack are the tactile and multisensory signals. Pressure on the skin, warmth, body cues, scent that more reliably activate oxytocin and endorphin systems. That's the defining difference between digital and face-to-face intimacy. One enters through vision and sound, while the other reaches deep into biological regulation. Oxytocin remains the standout in this picture. It builds during sustained proximity, during hugs, strokes on the arm, or just unbroken eye contact in person. Endorphins, natural opioids that dampen pain and promote well-being, also depend on genuine closeness, touch, and shared laughter in a physical space. Over a screen or through an app, those triggers don't fire strongly. No tactile receptor is pressed, no vagus nerve pathway is stimulated, no body warmth anchors the signal. Digital connection carries value. It reinforces bonds mentally and boosts mood in the short term, but by physiology's standards, it remains partial. That's why a video chat can lift spirits for an hour only to leave a hollow ache untouched. The signal sat shallow, never permeating the roots. This mismatch is visible when comparing population data with personal reports. In 2025, people are messaging, calling, and video chatting more than ever, across all age brackets. At the same time, WHO reports, Harvard summaries, and APA polls align on this finding. Even as digital connectedness rises, subjective loneliness remains stubbornly high. The conclusion emerges clearly. Contact quantity is not equal to biological nourishment. Digital communication maintains awareness of your network, but it does not fully trigger the calming, trust-building chemistry of presence. A useful way to frame this is as maintenance versus nourishment. Digital intimacy helps sustain the structural outline of a relationship during separation. Think of families split across continents, soldiers overseas, or friends living in different time zones. Video calls and texts keep the thread live, preventing collapse. They reduce emotional danger and keep memory of bonds strong. But at the chemical level, trust systems remain underfueled until touch, proximity, and embodied presence re-enter. Maintenance keeps the house standing, nourishment strengthens its foundations. The garden imagery fits neatly again. Messaging and video chats act like mist sprayed over dry soil. For a brief interval, leaves gleam and the garden looks better, but the water doesn't reach the roots. When the surface dries, the deeper systems remain thirsty. That is why long calls may ease the mind yet leave mornings still restless, why digital closeness fades faster than the hunger for real contact. If a metaphor helps more vividly, digital intimacy is often like comfort food, quick dopamine, limited nutrition. Binging on fast carbs fills you up, but the body doesn't receive the vitamins and proteins it truly requires. Screens can satisfy emotional cravings for a short stretch, yet biological hunger returns quickly because endorphins and oxytocin weren't released at depth. This explains the paradox you may have felt. Hours invested in group chats can leave you laughing in real time but aching afterward, like a stomach full yet a body weak. Accounts from daily life make this pattern tangible. People describe feeling anchored during online sessions, watching movies with friends over streaming platforms, spending nights in group Discord conversations, or maintaining a string of memes with family chats. In those moments, anxious energy softens and they feel less cut off. Yet when describing their bodies, many note fatigue, restlessness, or aches from being untouched for weeks. They can scroll endlessly, share jokes all night, and still wake feeling their social skin is starved. The paradox is not emotional ignorance, it is chemistry unfulfilled. Still, it's vital not to dismiss digital contact outright. It prevents collapse for millions. For the elderly, for those with mobility limitations, or for people in marginalized communities, digital spaces can offer life-saving validation. Dopamine signals reward, stress reduces when a friend responds kindly online. This form of contact surely matters. The issue is not about whether digital intimacy counts, it clearly does. It's about whether we treat it as complete nutrition or supplemental support. Like a vitamin pill, it plays a critical role, but was never designed as the core diet itself. Survey data underscores the caution. Countries with near-total adoption of social platforms show no decrease in loneliness despite rising contact. Instead, elevated loneliness scores persist alongside intensified digital usage. This suggests that while people communicate more frequently, their bodies remain deprived of the biologically grounding signals that only physical proximity provides. In garden terms, the mist keeps leaves alive but roots drying deeper. The health outcomes align with this interpretation. Individuals who rely heavily on digital connection but lack physical presence often show heightened cortisol profiles during lab testing, more disrupted sleep patterns, and increased reports of depression symptoms. Digital signals relieve emotional stress fleetingly. Yet without oxytocin release and endorphin buffering, the alarm system stays active, the sleep cycle remains fragile, and pain networks stay raw. Online contact informs the mind of belonging, but the nervous system waits for confirmation it never receives. Here's where you can apply this understanding to your own life. Ask whether your daily or weekly contacts include physical presence, shared activities, or synchronized group rituals. These are the interactions, whether it's a family meal, a walking partner, a team activity, or a simple hug, that most reliably nourish your body's chemistry. Digital conversations strengthen awareness, but embodied practices feed the deeper need. This single question helps distinguish whether your garden is being misted or truly watered. It's helpful to notice the rhythm after digital interaction. You laugh, share, feel lighter, but if you check in with your state hours later, a restlessness often returns. That restlessness is the absence of oxytocin linkage and endorphin activation. It does not signify that the friendships aren't real. It signals that the biology considers the exchange unfinished. A hug, eye contact, group singing, or even casual shoulder squeezes are the continuation your body expects to complete the circuit. The outlook here is not hopeless. Digital platforms can serve as bridges. They help preserve relationships during distance, coordinate face-to-face meetings, and sustain awareness when direct contact isn't possible. The issue arises only when they become mistaken for the whole. Scrolls and emojis can substitute briefly, but if physical rituals never resume, biology will still treat the garden as thirsty. It requires rain, not only mist. So digital intimacy is best thought of as partial care. It strengthens memory of bonds and reduces collapse during separation. But it cannot fully power the hormonal systems of trust, safety, and repair. Its strength lies in keeping paths open until embodied connection resumes. Its limitation is in leaving the body half-fed if it becomes the only source. That's the takeaway. Digital contact helps, but it functions best as a bridge toward real-world closeness rather than as a permanent replacement. The distinction is critical because it turns connection from a temporary patch into lasting nourishment. which naturally raises the next question. If deeper recovery depends on physical shared presence, then what practical steps are available to begin refilling that garden in daily life? Replanting the garden, practical steps. Rebuilding intimacy doesn't require starting life over. The science shows the brain can be restored through accessible, consistent actions, small steps that reactivate oxytocin pathways, tame cortisol surges, and strengthen trust circuits. This section is about those practical strategies, ways to replant the garden in daily life so recovery can take root. The first and simplest is physical microconnections. Brief touch like a handshake, a hug with a friend, or a hand on the shoulder activates oxytocin pathways and measurably reduces cortisol spikes, according to ecological momentary and experimental touch studies. Even a few seconds calm the amygdala and cue the nervous system to relax. Most people underestimate how powerful this can be because modern social norms make casual touch rarer. But repetition matters. Greeting people with intentional physical warmth several times a week sends steady drops of reassurance into neural soil. Community engagement layers in additional benefits. Studies in 2025 show that structured participation, such as volunteering, neighborhood events, or educational groups, correlates not just with increased opportunities for interaction, but also with improvements in resilience markers like heart rate variability. These settings deliver oxytocin through shared activity and simultaneously quiet the default mode network, which otherwise drives rumination. Group involvement also reframes self-image. Simply being part of an ongoing structure provides evidence to the brain that belonging is real, even if bonds are not intimate in a private sense. Solo grounding practices also help. Meditation, slow breathing, and journaling have all been shown to nudge oxytocin upward while reducing stress circuitry reactivity. Research on vagus nerve stimulation highlights how placing a hand on the chest during mindful breathing slows the heart rate and quiets alarm signals. These are modest biochemical responses compared to affectionate touch, but they still create breathing space. Think of them as protective mulch. While waiting for rainfall, these solo practices shield the surface, reducing erosion until more direct nutrients arrive. Rituals add another dimension. Group singing, chanting, or shared meals are among the oldest human mechanisms for collective bonding. Synchronizing voices or actions doesn't just feel pleasant, it stimulates endorphin systems, elevates mood, and increases a sense of trust across participants. Research shows communal ritual reduces perceived stress and builds social safety nets in both secular and spiritual contexts. A weekly potluck, attending community choirs, or joining a group walk provides reliable opportunities for these effects. Social hobbies involving synchronization, like dance groups, choirs, or team sports, carry similar impact. Coordinated movement boosts oxytocin and dopamine together, reinforcing reward pathways and decreasing isolation. Synchronization tricks the nervous system into attaching trust signals to those involved. After even a single session of coordinated activity, participants often report higher closeness with their group than with acquaintances they've known longer. These hobbies, while easy to dismiss as entertainment, in fact act as rhythmic rainfall, nourishing trust chemistry more effectively than solitary interactions or digital substitutes. Authentic connection doesn't need romantic context. A warm greeting at a cafe, laughing with a coworker, or taking a moment for a direct check-in with a neighbor suffices. Brains process these interactions as valid intimacy cues, provided they are genuine. The critical element is frequency, not grandeur. Small actions repeated steadily reverse deprivation in a measurable way. Research shows these changes are reversible. Regular, repeated connection rebuilds stress regulation and social reward circuitry over weeks to months. Recovery does not rely on dramatic milestones, but on steady drops. Pets play a remarkable role here as well. Stroking a dog or cat reliably reduces cortisol, lowers blood pressure, and stimulates oxytocin release. Experiments confirm that affectionate interaction with pets provides measurable calm, acting as a stabilizer for those living alone or those without daily access to touch. Therapy animals are described humorously as mobile pharmacies for a reason. They deliver daily surges of the same chemicals core to human bonding. While animals cannot replace human intimacy entirely, they represent a consistent and meaningful buffer against loneliness. Because these practices are most powerful when repeated, here's a simple experiment you can run: a 7-day microconnection challenge. Each day, aim for at least one 60-second physical greeting, a handshake, hug, or intentional touch, or one 20-minute face-to-face interaction with someone in your circle. Notice how your stress levels, mood, and sleep patterns shift across the week. This is not a clinical trial, but it is a direct behavioral application of what the research already suggests. consistent connection strengthens body and mind. To keep this action focused, here are crisp reminders you can carry forward. Brief touch, handshake, hug stimulates oxytocin and lowers cortisol. Group rituals, meals, singing, chanting activate endorphins and trust. Pets reduce stress hormones and elevate oxytocin. Solo grounding practices calm the vagus nerve and soften alarms. Synchronization through dance, choir, or sport boosts dopamine and bonding. Each of these works through specific, research-linked biological pathways. They are not grand interventions, they are daily irrigation systems for stressed soil. The result is not instant, but with repetition, the drought eases and new growth appears unmistakably. It's also empowering to remember that every act of connection benefits not only you, but others. Intimacy cues spread socially. Your rising oxytocin signals lift another person, and theirs reinforce yours. In this way, small personal steps ripple outward into community resilience. Human systems, like gardens, share hidden roots underground. By restoring your own connection practices, you strengthen the unseen fabric supporting those around you too. The task then is not waiting for intimacy to arrive spontaneously, but cultivating it deliberately. Even small acts done on purpose create stability for circuits thrown off balance by scarcity. Over weeks, the amygdala recalibrates, the hippocampus regains ground against cortisol, the DMN eases its self-criticism, and stress responses soften. Every repetition works like another layer of rain soaking into dry soil. These strategies show the recovery process is accessible, rooted in small, repeatable choices that most people can introduce into daily life immediately. That reassurance matters. It shifts deprivation from something that feels permanent into something flexible, with clear points of entry. Intimacy scarcity may have bent your brain toward withdrawal, but reshaping begins one handshake, one laugh, one shared breath at a time. When action accumulates, the depleted systems come alive. What once seemed brittle begins to stabilize, and what felt hopeless starts producing results. Oxytocin feeds safety back into the brain, endorphins ease pain, and dopamine rebuilds the sense of reward in relating again. These layers, built patiently, rewire circuits that once assumed rejection was certain. And as connection returns, perspective shifts too. Life's difficulties remain, but they are carried differently. Stress becomes lighter, self-critical loops grow quieter, and ordinary relationships feel sturdier. The biology adapts in reverse, demonstrating the core truth. Recovery from intimacy deprivation is not abstract. It is tangible, measurable, and within reach through everyday acts. Which sets up our final reflection. What actually happens to a brain when it waits through drought, but finally receives steady rain again? Connection changes the brain not as theory, but as biology. Deprivation reshapes circuits, expecting rejection, keeping alarms on, and sharpening self-criticism. Yet small, real interactions begin to reverse this. Even brief steps, a 10-minute voice call, one hug, or joining a local gathering, stimulate oxytocin and endorphin systems, lower cortisol, and start restoring balance. Research shows even tiny repeated acts shift chemistry over time, so progress doesn't require perfection. Here's your challenge. Choose one micro step this week and share in the comments what you picked. And if you found this helpful and want more evidence-based ways to repair your inner garden, like and subscribe. Hope begins with the smallest act of connection.